You're listening to Beyond Bossfights, gaming conversations with interesting people. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of Beyond Bossfights. This is Braxwolf, your host, and today we are going to be continuing our conversation about gaming communities. If you're with us last episode, episode 5, we talked about the in-game gaming communities a little bit. We also spend quite a bit of time talking about the Newbie Blogger Initiative, which at this point is over, but it went throughout the entire month of May, and it was a lot of fun. I participated. I think I mentioned that on the last podcast. I participated as a newbie, but I also did some interesting things that I had never done before. I wrote a poem and posted it on my blog, which I think was kind of cool. I don't know that I do it very often. I had to get into a much different frame of mind than I normally would when doing a blog post. And I also actually posted an article about starting a new podcast and some considerations that you might want to think about as if you have any interest in starting a podcast up for the first time. So if you want to check that article out, if you're interested in that at all, that is over at braxwolf.com, and you can search for considerations for starting a podcast, and it should come up. Talk about several things such as what should I podcast about, talk a little bit about the structure of a podcast, the audience that you need to take into consideration, promoting your podcast, and then I even go into a little bit of detail about the equipment that I use, which is a little bit technical maybe for some folks, but the thing about that is you don't really even need to worry about that section. That section is more for those who want to try and put out a little bit higher quality sounding podcast. But if you're just going to try it out and you're a gamer, you probably have a gaming headset with a microphone sitting around somewhere. That's what you could start with. At any rate, our guest on the last episode was Roger Edwards from Contains Moderate Peril. He does a blog and podcast of the same name, covering gaming, movies, and pop culture, and basically, as he says, whatever he sees fit to put on it. Roger's also going to be my guest this episode because what happened was we had so much to say about gaming communities that I had to split the episode into 2 parts. In this one, we're going to cover the official game forums as a community. We're going to talk about unofficial game forums, which is those forums that don't fall under the administration of the game company that is putting out the game. We're going to talk about fan sites and blogs. Kind of group those two together, blogs being kind of maybe a smaller version of the fan site, but they both serve a very similar purpose. We're going to talk about press sites, like Massively I think is the one that we mention, probably the one that a lot of MMOers are most familiar with, but there's others out there, MMORPG.com and things of that nature. They're not really fan sites. They do more news coverage. They're more like a newspaper that covers specific topics like MMOs and other games. We also go into a little bit about YouTube and streaming communities, probably the youngest and newest type of communities that involve gaming, not only from a perspective of the age of the members who use those communities, who make up those communities, but also the communities themselves. So because streaming and video recording and playback is kind of a newer technology when you consider online gaming and audio and website text posting and some of those types of things. Those things predate a lot of the communities that revolve around video. So we go into those topics a little bit, and it actually kind of feels like we jump right into the middle of the conversation because in essence that's kind of what we're doing. So this conversation takes quite a while. There's a lot of ground to cover, so I'm not going to delay us any further. We're just going to jump right into the middle of the conversation. Away we go. And you mentioned the official game forums. That's one of our favorite topics as gamers.
Oh, yes.
It's interesting to me because I don't have a ton of experience with official game forums, and I've said this to many people who've asked me, why don't you participate more in the forums, or this was in the forums, why didn't you see it? I don't have time to go to the official game forums because there is pages of information there, and I don't have time to try and find the information that I'm looking for through all of that data. Especially for a game like LOTRO that's been around for 7 years, there is just all kinds of history there. And what I've noticed is that, and I guess as somebody who quasi reports on LOTRO for another podcast and fan site, LOTRO Players, it irritates me a little bit when I hear the response from a gaming company that we've already answered that in the forums. It's almost as if their primary method of communication between themselves and the players is to post something in the forum. They don't issue a press release. They don't, do a community update where they talk about anything significant. They just put a post in the forums and they expect people are going to go there and read it. So do you think that's an effective way to communicate with your player base?
No, I don't. It's a very sort of late 90s sort of attitude, isn't it? It's like, the forum is the de facto way to get news out there. And I think you can go on the internet and quickly get some statistics that show that official forums for most games attract a very small percentage of the player base. And the people that tend to use the forums always tend to be the slightly more dedicated fans, sometimes the more vociferous or outspoken fans. So I think although you do get a great deal of information on forums, it doesn't always reach the wider player base. And sometimes the forums themselves can be not a good representation of that player base. And I've seen some forums sort of wax and wane over a period of time and go from being a very good place for an interactive dialogue with other players to becoming toxic or just not fit for purpose. You've got to do more than that these days. This is why I think a lot of new games are becoming very proactive in not only just running forums, but making sure that they use every form of social media at their disposal. I regularly see tweets from ArenaNet and SOE. SOE are proving to be an absolute revelation at the moment with the way they communicate with their players, with not only their existing games, but all the new games. I mean, John Smedley's got a blog that he regularly updates. He tweets all over the place. There's live streams going off more often than not. Some game developers just seem to be really good at this, and then some Turbine still seem to be just dragging heels. I mean, we'll give Turbine some credit. They've tried very hard recently, and it's nice to see the live streaming. It's nice to see the executive producer turning up and talking on the live stream, but it is coming to the party a little late.
Yeah, I will agree that I'm glad to see some of the turnaround that's going on with different streams of communication, so to speak, from Turbine. And I also agree that Smedley has really done a good job with Sony. And I think that when you've got somebody like that who is a powerful and charismatic personality and is at the top, then it's much easier to bring those new ideas in than to try and, there may be one or two people that, let's just say Turbine. I don't know anything inside Turbine, but let's just use them as an example. If somebody is at the bottom of the totem pole is trying to bring this organizational, cultural change in, that's much, much more difficult than the guy at the top saying, look, this is what we need to be doing. Everybody go do it. Because then people snap, right? People will go do it. It's still very top down, and it's nice to see that some of the folks at the top are starting to really get it.
Indeed. And I just find it so strange that it's SOE who are reinventing themselves at the moment, because you go back a few years and they had a bit of problems with their sort of player communication, but now they just seem to be leading from the front, and I applaud that, and I hope a lot more companies take a leaf out of their book.
I do too, and I hope they also realize that there are going to be missteps when you do that. There's almost as much danger in over communicating when you're not ready to, as there is in not communicating enough. I hope that's not a reason for them to stop doing it though, because I think it's probably still better to over communicate. And like Smedley he's had to go back on a few things that he said. Most specifically, I think the most recent thing was it H1Z1? Is that what it's called? Hizzy?
Yes, indeed. Hizzy.
Hizzy. When he originally was alluding to Hizzy coming out, he compared it to Star Wars Galaxies. And then when Hizzy was announced, everybody said, that's nothing like Star Wars Galaxies. Why did you lead us on like this? But he was kind of, at the time, that was what was in his mind, mechanic wise, was the most comparable thing that he could, communicate at the time. And unfortunately it was received differently from the player base than what he had intended.
Well, as you said, this is one of the potential pitfalls of being so open, but I think any mature organization will appreciate the fact that there will be the occasional stumble, but overall people will allow that and will accommodate that. But what they won't tolerate is just being blanked or just being completely ignored. I think those days we've got to move on from them.
So coming back to the official game forums, I'm going to ask this question, I think, or throw it out there for several of our categories. What do you think is the motivation to have this community?
I think that very much depends on what the community is associated around, what game, what product. Returning to Guild Wars 2, because it's a fairly new game, ArenaNet, as I said, are over most social media and are very good at communicating and the flow of information, but it is still very much their bat and ball. Everything is done under the official guildwars2.com website. The forum is there, the wiki is there, and it's quite curious because in the past with older MMOs, a lot of major resources have developed organically, sometimes with the help of the actual games developers, sometimes just by fans. I get the impression with some of the more recent games, the developers like to have interaction with their player base, but they still want to be the person with their hand on the rudder, as it were. So I find that quite interesting. And some companies, their primary motivation for participating and fostering a community is usually just to make it an extension of their marketing. You roll back time and look at some of the older MMOs, and I think the intentions were probably a little bit more earnest. They just wanted the fans to become involved because they were their customers, and the developers dug the game as much as the fans did, as it were. So like I say, I think it varies from organization to organization. But irrespective, really, at the end of the day, of what they think, if the fans take it upon themselves that they're going to do something within the community, then they'll just go ahead and do it regardless.
Mm-hmm. Right. So as far as the official game forums go, there's obviously, as we said before, when there's people involved, there are pitfalls. What do you think the pitfalls are for the game company of having to maintain this forum community?
It's a lot of hard work for them. I mean, people frequently curse community managers, but it's not a job that I would like to take myself.
No.
You have to have nerves of steel and hide of leather, and you've got to be a consummate diplomat because gamers are very passionate, and that sometimes is shorthand for absolutely, totally difficult to please all the time, and the moment something doesn't meet their approval, they'll go off alarmingly. So it's a lot of hard work. there's a lot of things that I've learned over the years that I didn't know originally. I mean, things like running competitions and giveaways for these sort of sites, and it's very difficult because of the legalities, particularly when you've got an international player base. So the most innocuous announcement, the most simple of statements has to be run by multiple departments to make sure that no one's trodden on anyone's toes. You've got to make sure that what's legal in the US is the same in the EU, because there is some disparity sometimes between legislation and so forth and such like. So there is a lot of hard work, and you make a mistake and it can blow up very, very, very quickly and be extremely detrimental to games developers. I mean, I can think of a few incidences where simple ideas were not well received, and at some point we're looking at doing quite a great deal of harm. CCP and EVE Online and the cosmetic monocle, I believe, that was rather exorbitantly priced. And what else? The $50 hobby horse that was kicked around in Lotro caused a great deal of unpleasantness. So I can understand why some companies want to vociferously now keep this all under their own control and just keep a tighter lid on it, because sometimes devolving it or being a little bit more casual with it can lead to potential problems.
How about for the gamers, the customers of these game companies? Obviously, I've seen in my limited visits to the official forums at Lotra, I've seen some posts that must have taken the person 45 minutes to an hour to compose. People can get very, very involved about these things that they're passionate about. What do you think are the pitfalls of going that route?
It's great. I mean, it's nice to see people that passionate, and frequently when I've read posts like that, so many people have so much information at their disposal. You can learn so many things about the game. But I think sometimes this can lead to very adversarial relationships, particularly when I always look at my relationship as a customer. And I think a lot of gamers think differently, and they transcend their customer relationship, and they even feel that they're somehow part of that game, part of that company that creates the game. Some people, you read their posts sometimes and you think, well, you're not exactly on the board of directors. I don't think you should actually be making statements like that. But that's the nature of gaming and the passion that it instills. And this gets exacerbated even more so now with things like Kickstarter. If a game gets financed through Kickstarter, then right from the get-go, you've got people who virtually feel that they're like shareholders, although technically they're not. And there's the question of objectivity as well. I think sometimes both sides of the community, particularly within these forums or these very tight sort of social groups, sometimes can't see the woods for the trees. And I think it doesn't do any harm for all groups sometimes just to step back and take get a sense of perspective upon things. Because it breaks my heart when you hear about people sending death threats to developers and stuff, which is totally unnecessary and not required. And it's so easy to say these, I'll just write these people off as crazy people. And I think a lot of the time they're not. They're just fans that have just had a momentary lapse of judgment and done something very, very childish that they probably do regret afterwards. But it doesn't do anyone any good, situations like that. And just seems to be becoming a little bit too common these days.
Now, there are also players, speaking of passion, that for whatever reason don't find the official game forums to their liking. They don't perhaps like the policies that are in place there. They don't perhaps relate to the community that has sprung up and posts the most there. And we find that there are game forums that also are created outside of the official realm of the game company sanctioned forums in the form of unofficial game forums. So I know that, Roger, for a fact that you frequent some of these as well. And,
Yes, I do.
I was just wondering if you had any kind of conceptualization of why these communities come to be and what the purpose or motivation of the players is when they create them.
Sometimes it can be for reasons as simple as the fans are filling a gap in the market. Sometimes you'll have a game where the developers and the community managers for that game really don't have a designated home or a platform that allows suitable discussion. Some games, particularly as the MMO market or whatever genre it is becomes more competitive, as the player base drops, the revenue drops, so things like the forums get closed or moved to places like Reddit. Which is not an environment that a lot of people would feel happy about going to, even if, that is based possibly on a misconception. So sometimes you'll just get forums, unofficial forums spring up because fans are just naturally filling a gap in the market and wanting to consolidate information. Other times it's done through dissatisfaction, and the most obvious example I can think of is the what's known as the Lotro community, which is aka the unofficial Lotro forums, which was initially created to fill the gap of the Codemasters forum for when Lotro was split between an EU and a US service, and the Codemaster forum shut down when the game consolidated. And some people just took the attitude it would be nice to have that forum available again in a different format. But that has now sort of evolved into a sort of I won't say the anti-Lotro forums, but it's become the adopted home for a great deal of people who feel that the official forums are just not a fit place for measured discussion anymore. The only sad point about that is because it's attracted so many people who are not entirely happy with the way the game is evolving. I think it's sort of veered too much into the negative, and then you do get sort of like a whiff of toxicity about it, and it ends up becoming a sort of a mirror of the very thing that it's dissatisfied with.
Yeah, I think I visit those forums probably even less frequently than the official game forums, but I've noticed that there is some measured discussion that goes on, which is good and probably needed, but the negativity you talk about for some reason seems to snowball very quickly, and I don't know if it's the mob mentality taking over or just the fact that there are, like you said, it's made up of dissatisfied individuals that don't feel that posting on the official forums will do them any good, so they use it as more of a ranting forum, a ranting place to go.
Indeed, I think it's best for us not to generalize, and I would like to say that there has been some good material come from the unofficial Lotro forums, and there are two people who are residents there who actively participate on the player council. But like you say, there are some people there who are very passionate, and because now the game is not moving in a direction that they're happy with, that passion is turning to sort of anger, and it manifests itself in quite a lot of what's said. There seems to be a cult of criticism about one particular individual in the Lotro community, the community manager. And then there are a few people, and let's not mince our words, they like to go there because it's a place where they can go where they can just start trouble and bother. Which is a shame, but there is a species of person that just seems to be attracted to such environments and just likes to go there and sort of stir the pot, as it were.
So do you think that it's helpful to have these types of environments that are outside of the realm of control of the game publisher? That is it helpful for the game, or is it more hurtful for the game to have those in place?
I think overall that it's beneficial. I think if anyone's out there talking about your product, whether they're doing it in an official or an unofficial capacity, that is a good thing. That is free promotion. Yes, there's always a risk that things can turn a little nasty, but I just think the benefits outweigh the the negative connotations, and I certainly wouldn't want to see a sort of environment where the game developers felt that they felt threatened by unofficial resources on the internet, and then started getting the legal wheels in motion where they actually stymied such undertakings.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good. Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to, being a red, white, and blue American, I'm tempted to say that any type of free speech is beneficial, but sometimes it's hard to look at that environment. I know there's a particular person that I play with that tends to have to detox from either the official or unofficial forums sometimes, because he gets in there and gets so depressed that he even thinks about maybe the future of the game is in jeopardy, or he kind of goes overboard, because of all of the different, I want to say, polarizations of the reactions of people on those forums. It seems like there's not as much in the middle for people who are posting as there is on either side of the positive and negative side, because usually people, unless they're stepping in to try and calm things down, they have to be passionate enough on one side or the other in order to actually sit down and write a post out.
That's true. I think it's very difficult to find a measured and well moderated forum these days. They either seem to be on one or other side of the spectrum. I do think that if certain websites become a little bit too toxic, they end up marginalizing themselves. So in a way, there is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy and a bit of self-correction built into it. I mean, I must admit, I flirted with the notion recently of setting up my own independent forum and trying to establish it in such a way where you could have a communicative platform, but there were rules and regulations in place to make sure that it didn't get out of hand, but still doing it in such a way where people had a basic right to express themselves. And one of the ideas that I had about how to establish this was just to make it by invitation only. That you invited someone that you knew or thought would be good to bring along, and in a way it was like bring someone, but you were indirectly sort of vouching for them, so you were slightly going out on a limb, and that sort of mutual understanding might foster a slightly more mature and measured approach to the people's participation in that forum. But as I said, it was just an idea, and it's currently on the back burner because obviously I have lots of ideas and only a certain amount of time.
Yeah, I remember that discussion, and it was one of those things that I looked at and said, yeah, that would be kind of an interesting thing to watch, but boy, I sure don't have a lot of time to pitch in and help set up, because that moderating forums, let's be honest, even if it's by invitation only, could potentially be a lot of work.
Oh yes, very much so. Very much so.
Now, moving on to something that's near and dear to both of us, we're still going to talk about, and I had these broken out at one time into fan sites and then a section for blogs, but I think that they're similar enough that we can probably talk about them together. Player fan sites, player blogs, either specific to the game or gaming in general. Talking about player or fan created content. And this is kind of going back to one of the original points made on the slide presentation. Do you think that these types of fan sites and blogs that are out there being done independently, whether they're being done to make money or not, I think in most cases they're not. They're just done out of a love of the game or a labor of love. Do you think they're effectively utilized by the actual game companies?
Again, I think it comes down to the individual companies. I can think of, we both know one incredibly high profile fan site that came out of nowhere and over a period of years became the biggest player within that particular fan community, that being Casual Stroll to Mordor on their Lotro related site. And I never, despite the fact that Turbine did have interaction with them, I never ever felt that they were getting the support that they should have got.
Right.
And I always found that quite fascinating, because at one point, if there was ever a press release or any sort of relevant information pertaining to Lotro, you didn't go straight to the Turbine website or the Lotro website. You went straight to Casual Stroll, because they had taken the press release that was buried somewhere, stripped it down, broken it into bullet points, and put it there in a really accessible fashion. And you think they've virtually become the unofficial PR department.
Yep.
And the Star Trek Online forums has a very, very busy user base, and a lot of the senior staff developing the game regularly appear on those forums and interact. You've got the Priority One podcast for Star Trek Online, and that is something that Cryptic are all over. That they've had several high-profile developers and senior people appear on that show because they appreciate the fact that it is the number one podcast for that game, and it reaches a lot of people, and it would just be foolish not to take an opportunity like that. So some companies seem to do this well, and others just don't seem to get it. Some people are still labouring under a rather archaic attitude that your customers have to be corralled, because if they're not, they become a threat, or they become a problem, or they become at odds with your marketing scheme. And I just think, what's a game if people don't play it? It's pointless. So anything that fans do that is connected to your product, I think you've got to endorse, unless they are telling out and out lies about your product or not reflecting it in a particularly good light. But by and large, I think it's very important for companies to get involved with this. I mean, I mentioned Guild Wars 2 earlier and how they like to do a lot themselves, but that doesn't detract from the fact that they know that Dolphy.net is the best guide for that game. Anything that happens in Guild Wars 2, it's in Dolphy.net within a matter of hours, to the point that I believe that there's even an NPC in the game that's been named after them as recognition. And I know that World of Warcraft and Blizzard have always been good at that, interacting with their community. People that have done things within the community that are of note have ended up being immortalized within the game itself. So yeah, some companies are very, very shrewd at it. And others, well, I know people that have got in touch with developers and said, I run quite a successful site. Not me, the person getting in touch, and said, I do this. Can we possibly have any merchandise for a giveaway? And they just get completely stonewalled, which to me just seems ludicrous.
Yeah, I agree that this is something that should be probably leveraged more. However, to be fair, let's concede that there are difficulties with engaging with fan sites. One of the most probably prominent ones would be the perception of favoritism by other sites that perhaps do not get the same type of treatment. I don't know what kind of measuring stick would have to be used in order to say, yeah, but not every little guy who just spun up a WordPress site in the last week can come and get a bunch of code cards, or whatever it may be.
Oh, yes. No, I fully understand that, and obviously the developers have to make an informed choice. Sites that vociferously debate the rights and wrongs of a game might not necessarily find as much favour as a site that's just devoted purely to in-game cosmetics. And I think obviously traffic is going to dictate how seriously you are taken by the game developers, because at the end of the day, they're wearing several hats, and although they've got their "yay, we're supporting you" hat on, they've also got their cynical marketing hat. This person's got 100,000 people or 200,000 people a day or 1 million. Yes, we'll definitely throw some loot their way. And this one over here, they only get about 1,000 people a day. Maybe not so.
One of the things that I've found curious as I've gotten a little bit more into how this stuff works within the industry is that at least the companies that I've worked with or have observed people working with tend to separate public relations from community relations. And typically the fan sites will fall under community relations, while press sites will fall under public relations. And those are two completely different ways sometimes that companies deal with folks. Do you think that fan sites should be treated more like actual press?
Probably not. There is a lot of the talk at the moment about the state of games journalism. I personally happen to believe that broadly games journalism is not yet at its peak at the moment. I find that a lot of the sites that I go to are, the formal gaming news websites. Literally, when a story breaks, you just flick between them, and they've all recycled the same press release, and everyone seems very reticent to express any real opinions, because potentially that could harm their relationship with the PR departments. So I like the separate nature of fan sites, and I don't want them to be sort of lumped in with professional journalism. I like the fact that they are independent and do their own thing, and I think we very much live in a culture at the moment where the word of mouth recommendation is becoming a lot more important than your opinion being swayed by what you read on the official websites or the standard news outlets. So no, I think it's fan sites need to be proud of what they are, and I know some people might aspire to drift towards games journalism, and I know that some fan bloggers do actually have clear ideas of using that as a stepping stone into writing for the bigger sites. I think I can think of a few people who will actually say, yeah, that's how they did it. But, that's a slightly different thing. I think fan sites have a unique place, and at this moment in time, that is possibly the best position to be in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about this question a little bit, being that I contribute to a fan site, and it's really kind of a double-edged sword, because as a fan site, you don't get invited to all the big press events, so you never get anything first. Basically, like you said, CSTM did. They took something that was out there, either reported on or posted in the forums, and they massaged it into something that was easily digestible. That's kind of what we do too at Lotro Players, but I tend to also like to add my opinion about whatever it is we're reporting on, just to add something a little bit different and of something of maybe more value than, like you said, just being another press site that copied the AP release or whatever it may be. And I don't know that I would be quite as apt to do that if, there was a potential financial connotation to being brutally honest. And I don't know that I've ever really I tried to, like you said, I tried to take a measured approach to things, so I don't know that I've ever been too far on one side or the other, but I can remember one post I was actually pretty critical about Turbine, and it's usually their communication process. After they had their layoffs a few months ago, I was very critical about how they didn't communicate to the fans or the player base at that point. And they eventually did come out and communicate something a week later, but it was like, by that time, I was still, that was kind of just my beef with them. And I don't know that I would be quite as quick to post something that was written out of passion like that if there was like some kind of a potential financial hit to, say, my friend Andang, who runs the site. I would hate to put his livelihood in jeopardy because I did something like that.
These are considerations to be made. I think when people start blogging and podcasting, live streaming, producing some sort of content around the things that they love, I think at one point, or at some point, if your traffic starts growing and you find that more and more people are reading what you have to say, like it or not, there will become a tipping point where you have to at least consider what your responsibilities are, because you will have a certain percentage of people that are very trusting and liking of your work, and they will hold a lot of stock by your opinion. And I think you owe it to yourself and them to at least think about what you then do. And like you say, if you're working collaboratively with other people, I think sometimes you have to offset the consequences of making, say, a controversial post and what the potential feedback has got. So I'm not saying that you should use that as a reason not to stick your head above the parapet, but I just think that whenever you're communicating with people, be it in huge numbers or in quite small groups, I still think that there's a burden for you to think, stop, ponder for a second time exactly what you're going to say and how you say it, rather than just jumping in with both feet.
Yeah, and that's something I think that I'm tending to learn on the fly. I jumped into Lotro players without having started my own blog first, and it's been an interesting experiment because I've had to learn. I'm going to call it journalism integrity on the fly. And when I say that, I guess I mean what is ethical to post to a bunch of people that, to a very large population of people, because I didn't start small and I didn't get to learn as I grew my blog what would be acceptable and would not be acceptable. I've had to think about it a little more carefully before I actually put it out there. And I've probably made some slip ups, and I think that, luckily they haven't been large enough that most people have noticed, but there's been some things that I put out there and I've gone, well, maybe I should have taken a day before I actually wrote that post up,
Indeed. It's like that old adage about an email when you've just had a falling out with your boss. You don't type and send, you type, walk away, have a cup of coffee, take a break, come back, sit, reread it, re-edit it, and then send. And right. I think that's the blogging thing as well. It's a learning experience, and sometimes, particularly returning to that subject of passion and gaming, I think there are times when you do have to take a moment.
I know you have a lot of experience in this, and so I wanted to throw it in here. What do you think some of the challenges are to building a community around a blog site?
The challenges, there are so many. First of all, people will come to your site because they're interested or they like the content. So there is the challenge of regularly coming up with interesting and engaging content on a regular basis, which is taxing. It's hard to do. I find myself regularly going through old posts to make sure that I'm not overtly repeating myself, although I know that I will at some point. I also know that I will regularly contradict myself, and I also know that there are times, although I aspire to be as broad and all-encompassing and inclusional as I can, I know there are times when I'm going to say stupid things and a bit crass, and I might upset some people. I don't do it on purpose, and I try and avoid it, but it will happen every now and then. I think so there's another challenge there to make sure that if you do have a specific set of values, that you do stick to them and don't just wander all over the place and end up making yourself look foolish because you're not sticking to the dogma or doctrine that you're actually espousing, as it were. And there's a lot of work around communities and maintaining them, because you don't just write and just say, there you go, I've written it, people will find it. You've got to actively engage with your readers or your listeners, which is nice. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you're sitting there thinking, well, this is a very interesting response. You then sit and rack your brains for 30 minutes because you want to come up with something interesting to throw back at people. Everyone's got busy lives these days. It seems to me that time's becoming an increasingly finite commodity. And there's a risk there of just doing too much and burning out. The public have very high expectations these days because professional tools have all of a sudden, in a very short period of time, suddenly become available to everyone. Most people won't particularly warm to the fact that, well, I don't like your blog theme, or that's not a particularly well-made video, or the sound quality on your podcast is a bit bad, or well, have you seen that site over there? They've got 3D and lasers, and you've got a sock puppet. Yeah, it's sometimes, I understand that there's a requirement to be professional, and there's no excuse for being slapdash, but sometimes it can be a bit of a heavy burden dealing with the expectations of your readership or the community that you're engaging with. And you're also dealing with passion and enthusiasm, and that does not always go hand in hand with logic. So sometimes you will write something that you think is really innocuous, and then you will have a raging lynch mob at your door with hose and rakes and flaming brands screaming for your blood. And then you have to calm that down. So there's a lot of challenges, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That can also be a very, very rewarding thing. I don't think challenges should always be looked upon as negative obstacles. I think challenges have got all sorts of positive connotations associated with them, and there's a great deal of satisfaction to be had from writing about something that you think is a little bit controversial and seeing that it's been well received by people, or getting some interesting feedback, or even better still, someone's pointing out that you are wrong and then actually giving you a measured reason why you are wrong, and you subsequently change your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's interesting. I'm actually going to take a lot of that advice to heart now that I've started my blog in the last few months, so I appreciate that. So we talked about fan sites, and we talked about whether they should be treated more like press. There are also press sites, the official press sites, gaming press, that typically are the first ones to get exclusive looks at new games, playthroughs of new games. They also, I threw press sites in here because they also have a fairly large community built around the press sites just within the comments of their articles. And I think you'll find a lot of people persistently coming back and commenting on posts for specific press sites that they follow.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at a site like Massively, it has huge amounts of comments, usually for the most simplest of posts, and if you start reading down the names and visiting on a regular basis, you'll see that it's centered around quite a small hardcore group of people. So in a way, it's offering the same sort of platform as a forum, and I think that's half the attraction. I find that the gaming press and a lot of these big sites, that they do, as we said earlier, a lot of just verbatim regurgitation of press releases. They do that clever thing of then putting a question to readers and just throwing it out there, and it's like, and then your readers do half the work for you.
Yeah.
And not all the time, because I know that sites like Massively still also publish a lot of opinion pieces, and a lot of them are very good ones. And I know that they're good ones because a lot of them annoy me and I disagree with them, and I think that's a good piece if it's having that response. But I also do get the impression sometimes that some of the bigger sites are literally sometimes just an extension of the marketing department for whatever is the game that they're promoting. And it does get a bit exasperating. I mean, there was a bit of controversy recently with Star Citizen, where the actual people that backed the game were promised early access, and then they were somewhat peeved to see access being thrown open to journalists before they actually got their hooks into it, and that caused some ill feeling. I can see both sides. It's important to get the press involved at sometimes, but doing that at the expense of the people that have actually put their hand in the pockets, I thought that was bad form. And again, I'll put my cards on the table. I do feel that the gaming press is a little bit in the doldrums at the moment. I watch a lot of video reviews of games, and they tend to be rather generic, covering sort of the good points of the game, and you think, oh, this seems a bit homogenous. Is this all just collated from a press release? Or else the gaming sites themselves have a charismatic person that does the show, and I get the impression that the show's more about them than the games. And I don't really dig that.
Yeah, I kind of bringing that back to community. I had a little bit of difficulty trying to figure out the question of motivation for the press sites. I think it has to do with, and I understand kind of how, going back to the technical aspect of things, Google actually indexes websites based a lot on, are the pages consistently updated, so that stale pages that have been out there since 1997 don't float to the top of the Google search list when you're looking for something. And I know that a lot of the advice that people give folks who are starting a blog out there is to, or that are starting a website, is to make sure that there is some kind of a forum or blog section of the site so that there is community interaction, because that counts as having your site updated when people actually comment on your posts. And so, I guess the skeptic in me is going, well, they're benefiting from in the Google search results from having all of these people commenting on their posts, and that's their main. Not only that, but it drives further traffic, right? The more people you have, the higher more people you have hitting the page to comment, the higher you go in the Google search results as well. So to me, that seems to be the primary motivation to actually even foster a community on a official press site.
Yeah, I would broadly agree with that, but I'll also hold my hands up. As a person that runs a website, I want people to visit it, and there are sometimes when I go out of my way to refresh older posts and put them at the top, and sometimes I'm quite pleased to see an old post get a comment and way someone's necroed a post from last year. That's good. That brings it back to the public's mind. So I'm a little bit guilty of that myself, so I won't get too self-righteous about it.
No, and I guess I wasn't. Where I draw the maybe a distinction is that I see people who I've commented on posts on CMP before, and I've seen you respond to people who have posted on CMP. Whereas you go to these major sites, and obviously everybody's busy, but I don't see a whole lot of interaction with the actual authors of the posts. I see a post go out, and then I see a bunch of people jump in to comment about it, and it seems as though the poster kind of holds their hands back and says, "Have at it, guys." So to me, that's a little bit different style of doing a community than it is when you're actually interacting with the people who are coming to visit your site.
Yeah, I suppose there is sometimes an element of, here's the question, there you go, knock yourself out. And it's literally just watching the various people commenting, having a bit of a fight between themselves. On some of the more controversial issues, the issues that are going to generate a lot of traffic, whenever they talk about pay to win or issues relating to gender and sexism and misogyny and things like that, I sometimes then see that the actual person that wrote the article will wade into the discussion a little bit more. I think sometimes just possibly to clarify their position, because they know that people will try and take what they've said out of context or misrepresent them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I realize that when you run a bigger site with a lot of traffic, you can't respond to every comment either, because that's just unfeasible. And it quite honestly would be pretty annoying. The next section is interesting because I think to me, it's not something I'm quite as familiar with. And it's kind of a newer emerging type of community, and that is around I'm going to call the YouTube generation of either recording and putting video out, or actually even more new than that is the streaming that people are doing with gaming, where they get themselves a Twitch channel, which is very easy to do, and they're fortunate enough to have enough internet bandwidth to be able to actually stream their play session for the evening and get people just show up in droves to watch them play. It seems to me, in working with some of the younger folks at Lotro Players, that this video thing is something that has been much more embraced by the younger community of gamers. And I don't know if you've seen that same thing.
Yes, definitely. These sort of new communities usually are very sort of age-centric, and they're more embraced by, I'm 46, so they're embraced usually by people a lot younger than me, because younger people have happily immersed themselves in this concept of immediacy. And I think that's what these mediums like YouTube and streaming provide. I come from a generation where I like to express myself through the written word, and I like to stop and think, where a lot of people just say, well, I want to know what this game's like. The most practical thing that you can do is just show me. And streaming addresses this. It provides immediacy. You can quickly get the handle of things. And it just seems to be the way that people like to communicate and learn these days. My son, who is 22, tell him about most things, and if he's got the option of going and getting a textbook or going on the internet and watching someone tell him about it or physically show him what to do, he'll opt for the other. And I don't consider that to be a bad thing, because as far as I'm concerned, it's still learning. It's just learning in a different way. And I just think it reflects the changes in technology. The fact that 10, 15 years ago, even if I'd wanted to have done live streaming, there just weren't really the resources there. Where now the resources are there, and it just becomes a natural extension for a person to start streaming their game and talk about it if they've already come from a generation that is happy to interact via things like smartphones and texting and other things of a similar sort of more immediate nature. So I've had a go at live streaming myself, and there were some technical issues, and then both me and Brian decided that it would take us a while to get into it because we found that we would stop playing to talk, or if we played too much, we would forget to talk.
Yeah.
But, this multitasking thing seems to be done a lot better by younger people because that's what they do. My son frequently will be sending a text message, having a conversation with me and having a conversation with someone else at the same time. I find it weird. He doesn't.
I have had a similar, discovery about, especially when you mentioned forgetting to say something. The first time I was on Fellowship of the Creeps, and I only did it twice, and part of the reason was because it was difficult for me to do. I found that it was very hard for me to talk and play at the same time. I was either doing one or the other, and luckily it wasn't up to me to drive that show because I could kind of fade into the background and and Andan could run the show. But there's just something about I can look at show notes and talk to you at the same time, but I can't be controlling my character and casting spells and shooting arrows and talking to you at the same time. That's very difficult for me to do as well. And I don't know if we just get worse at multitasking like that as we age, or if that's just something that we've, like you said, we hadn't grown up with the type of technology that necessitates that type of multitasking.
I like to think, I like to be optimistic about it. I think it's just like anything. It can be learned. Do it often enough and you'll get better at it. So I will possibly at some point try and tackle the live streaming thing. My biggest concern is I talk a lot, and whenever I do podcasts, I like to extensively edit them afterwards to bring them up to a standard. With live streaming, I have a horrible worry that I would lapse into all sorts of expressions and phrases and a mode of behaviour that might not be particularly edifying for me. And I'm not sure if I want to sort of inflict that upon the world. But just returning quickly to the reasons as to why younger gamers seem to gravitate towards this more. In some respects, it just does. To cut to the chase and get to the heart of a matter so quickly. When a new game's announced, I usually will pore over websites, press releases, and read up on it to find out what it has to offer. If you just watch somebody else playing a game, as long as you've got a clear view, and it is the next best thing to next to trying before you buy. It's a great way of just saying, this is the product, this is what it does, this is how it works. Do you like it? Are you interested? There is an honesty about it that is you can get to the heart of the matter, or you get to the heart of certain matters a lot quicker just by live streaming, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that even it's kind of funny because in this day and age, there are so many titles that you can just try freely. But even for those things, I find myself thinking, do I want to spend the 6 to 10 hours to download this game, or do I want to just go out and see if I'm going to like the way somebody else is playing it, so I don't have to monopolize my bandwidth while my wife is watching Netflix upstairs, So even just saving that amount of time and bandwidth is worth it for me to go out and check out. That's how I found out that's how I saw League of Legends for the first time. I haven't actually played that game because I went out and watched it and said, this just doesn't look like something for me. And so fortunately, I didn't spend the time putting it on my PC and taking up resources.
I think it's that marketing thing is one of the reasons why so many of the developers have now jumped onto live streaming. It's a great way of them showing what they want to show to the audience and drumming up enthusiasm for their product that's in development, because they just don't have to worry about developing press releases and concept art and advertising campaigns. It's a question of just come and see.
Now, the communities seem to be slightly different, at least in my experience. And I'm gonna share a story, but it's I'm not gonna name any names. I don't even remember names. But the YouTube community seems to come from a place where there's a lot of anonymity, at least in the beginning, before you could you had to link your Google Plus account for YouTube. And I don't know if that fostered what I'm going to quote unquote call a bad community, because it seems like Google is trying to clean that up a little bit. But I got several comments on one of my, I do a series with my sons, playing Lotro with them.
Yes.
And my oldest son has, he was only 12 years old at the time. So he was still a boy. He was still a kid, mind of a kid, but his voice has changed. Or has at least started to change. So he sounds a lot older than 12 years old. He probably sounds about 16 years old. And I got some comments on some of the videos I did with him from somebody in the YouTube community, basically saying, man, you shouldn't be playing with this guy. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's completely annoying, because he hadn't watched from the beginning of my series to realize that it was my son.
Uh-huh.
And then when he went back, I mean, some of the stuff was pretty bad. And I wasn't mad, because I kind of understand that community, but at the same time, my son's really proud to be out on YouTube. He shows his friends these videos that he plays with his dad. And so I went through and deleted the comments, but I thought to myself, this is it wasn't a terrible comment. It was just this guy not thinking that there's a person on the other end of the YouTube video. And also, I think a little bit coming from this community of YouTube, which just kind of pops off whatever comes into their mind. When they watch a video, they can comment on it, and then they can go away and not have to worry about it. And I think that perhaps there's still some growing to do there, some learning to be done within that community. And that's just kind of been my experience of it anyway.
I think that's very fair. In fact, if anything, possibly you're being too fair. I consider YouTube comments to be something like 75% toxic. You can put a YouTube video up of the most bland and innocuous thing. You could put a YouTube video of a cactus in a terracotta pot, and people would find something to be profane, unpleasant, racist, misogynist. You name an ist, there'll be ist about it. It's just like catnip to trolls. I just, like you say, because when it started, I don't think they anticipated it was going to be where it is now, and it did develop in this sort of frontier mentality, as it were. And yes, they are trying to clean it up, but it's for all the benefits that come with YouTube, it's still got a great deal of unpleasantness. I know people who, when they post certain videos on YouTube that include themselves, they just won't have the comments on, because they just know that there's going to be something unpleasant. It's just a question of when is it going to happen, and that's bad, and that's not particularly pleasant. I mean, Father Roderick, by very nature of the fact that he is a Catholic priest, he's got to have nerves of steel and a really thick skin, because you just know that if he places any sort of video, at some point down that list, there's going to be just some unpleasant comments made, just sniping at the fact that he's a priest and stuff like that. And it's just so unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And it is tough. So obviously, if you ever embark upon that, you do need to make a decision about what you're going to do with comments, and you have to think about putting yourself out there, or, as you know, in your case, you've got to think about the wider implications if you're not just putting yourself out there.
Right. And I will say, in fairness, that most of the comments I've gotten have been very supportive, and for the most part have been very positive. But you just have to be aware of that kind of stuff. In fact, I was going to leave the comments out there just because I understand the environment, and it didn't bother me. And my wife, being the sensible one, said, you really shouldn't leave those out there. Yeah. And then when I thought about it, I agreed with her. I said, that's right. I've never been a big fan of censoring stuff that's not really, really bad. But at this point, since it was something that could affect my son's psyche, that was definitely something to consider there. Anything else you wanted to add about the streaming communities?
The only thing I can think of is they're going to become bigger and bigger and more important.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the days, we kind of hit on this very early on in the podcast, the days of companies thinking of community as being simply their official forums are really over.
Yes.
They need to start embracing this type of thing. Like you said with Lotro, I'm really glad to see the streaming that's taking place there with actual developers. Now, I know that a lot of the Q&A is filtered before the developers get a chance to answer, but at least they're online and answering. Their answer is unfiltered to whatever question has been posed to them, and I think that's a huge step forward for Turbine. There you have it, community. Well, that brings us to feedback, and this week we have a couple of iTunes reviews to go over. I'm going to start with the one that I found over on the UK version of iTunes, and that was by Roger from Moderate Peril. He titled his review, An Entertaining and Insightful Show About the Gaming Community. Beyond Bossfights is a rather unique podcast insofar that it celebrates those that contribute to the wider gaming community. Braxwolf is an ideal host, asking his guests a broad mixture of questions in an intelligent and enjoyable manner. Keep an eye on this podcast. I suspect that this will be the show that everyone will want to be on in the months to come. Well, that's high praise, and I really thank you for that review. I do hope that folks enjoy being on the show, and I do hope to continue to showcase members of the community and potentially give them a voice and just have a fun time talking to them about gaming stuff. That's really what this is all about. Second iTunes review I have this month comes from the US version of iTunes, and I have 5 reviews over there, so I actually have a star rating. Thank you, everybody who gave me a star rating. That's pretty cool. It shows up when somebody finds my podcast in the iTunes store. This review comes from BraxFan303. It's called Beyond Fandom. And I want to say here first, before I read this review, I know for a fact that BraxFan303 was around before I started to contribute to the larger gaming community, because I saw a review that he left for Casual Stroll to Mordor podcast several years ago, before I was even on the scene. So, BraxFan303, I love your name. I have a piece of homework for you, though. I want you to email me at braxwolf@gmail.com and let me know where your name came from, because I've been so curious ever since I saw your review for Lotro Players where you got that name. Anyway, BraxFan303 said, one of the best podcasts out there, and it is done by Braxwolf, so that makes it awesome by default. What? Okay, but thank you. Keep them coming and continue to be amazing. I will try to, and I will try to. Thank you very much, BraxFan303. I appreciate hearing from you. You can send your feedback to braxwolf@gmail.com, and I'll read it on the podcast. Remember that Beyond Bossfights is on iTunes and would appreciate your ratings and reviews. Beyond Bossfights is also on Stitcher, so make sure to add it to your playlist. And by the way, I got an Android phone here in the last month, and the podcast app that I'm using actually found Beyond Bossfights when I did a search on it. And I think there are a lot of apps that you can use on Android that will search and find the iTunes library. If not, I do have a link to the podcast RSS feed on my blog, braxwolf.com, under the Subscribe to Beyond Bossfights section on the right-hand column. As for contact information, you can get a hold of Roger at rogeredwards@containsmoderateperil.com. His website is containsmoderateperil.com. You can follow him on Twitter at moderateperil. His YouTube channel is www.youtube.com/user/more-moderateperil. And he also has a Facebook page. As for me, you can follow me on Twitter at Braxwolf, BRAXWOLF. You can email me at braxwolf@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/Braxwolf. YouTube, youtube.com/user/Braxwolf. Or my blog, where I post all of my episodes and also various text posts and musings at braxwolf.com. Thank you so much for being with us this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. We will see you next time.